This is a really contentious issue, the whole issue of contact. How full of conflict these discussions about permanence often are at hearings, and how they can run on and on with all sorts of challenge and difficulty. But it's my experience in hearings, because I'm in hearings a lot, that contact issues cause just as much high emotion, and these decisions can be very challenging for us. And I think what's also difficult is that hopefully most of us have had good enough experiences of caregiving and attachment in our histories, but those experiences may not reflect some of the experiences that we're talking about the children having had. So that is kind of difficult, because of course when you're thinking about a precious relationship, the whole thought of reducing or particularly terminating contact, particularly terminating face-to-face contact, can just feel like a massive kind of decision. What I want to do is just take you through a simple framework which might be helpful when we're kind of asking questions of ourselves about the contact decisions that are in front of the panel and that are being perhaps recommended by the social worker in their reports. We have to think that quite often when we're working towards the possibility of return home, we have a high frequency of contact, deliberately set at a higher frequency, so that we can engage parents in active work in an intensive manner to test whether or not return home is going to be possible in the child's best interest. I just want to say something about that in relation to very small children, babies in particular. There's been a lot of research work recently about the impact of very frequent contact on babies and very small children, and the news is not good. Research from Australia, which found that babies who were in placements away from home and were having very frequent contact, daily contact with parent figures, that many of those very small children were really challenged in their ability to make any attachment relationship, because their routines of care were so disrupted by the frequency of contact. So that's not only Australian research, it's been repeated in Britain and in the south of England by a guy called John Simmons. If anybody's interested in the research, I did a review of contact research and literature not long ago. People might be interested in having a look at that, and it says a lot about how we should be careful. Now, the president of the family division in England used to insist that there was daily contact for small babies, until he was lobbied by one of the child psychiatrists, Daniel Glazer, who's a famous person for the social workers, who thinks about children's emotional well-being. And he decided that actually it was too much of a risk to have daily contact for these tiny children, and it wasn't necessarily in the parents' best interest either, because some of these babies sleep for the daily hour that they are seeing their parents, and there is little opportunity to do the active work on caregiving, on helping the parents to care for the child, emotionally as well as physically, because of course it's so relevant for babies in making those early bonds. Just really interesting that he's begun to make many, many more decisions which are about less frequent contact, but for a longer period, because that's actually been established to be more effective in return home. So we may think that high frequency leads more predictably, high frequency contact leads more predictably to return home. And actually it's not true. None of the research tells us that about babies. It's the quality of the contact. And if we're able to have less frequent but more meaningful contact, in which the parent can be supported to care for the child, then actually that's more predictive of safe early return home. So it's an important bit of research to hang on to, because I think we're still in some places seeing that there's an insistence that it has to be daily. So if anybody wants references to that research, I can tell you about it, because it's very interesting and it's very powerful. And why is that? It's because tiny babies, teeny weenies, up to 18 months at least, they're not only making relationships with adults, they're learning how to make relationships. Their brains are beginning to develop neural networks for processing the meaning of intimacy, mutuality, reciprocity in relationships, the give and take of affection, etc. So it's really important, so that if we interrupt that, we interrupt it at our peril. So I would just say that I just think we need to kind of remember that that's an important thing to have in mind. So quite often when we're on the road to permanence, we may have made our best attempts in the past very recent past, to work towards return home, but sadly it's not possible in the child's best interests. So what happens to the contact then? So I'm just going to go through a simple kind of framework with you, and there's a sheet in your pack which mirrors this, so that if you wanted to remember these areas to have in your mind when you're approaching making decisions, there's a single sheet about impact, as well as the PowerPoint handout. So, and hopefully that'll remind you after the session if you feel it might be useful to you. So what I would say is that when we are moving away from return home, the purposes of the contact change. And one of the crucial areas and things to think about is what is or are the purposes of contact for this child now. So what we're commonly doing in some other parts of the country is we're going to hearings and we're saying we have a working agreement with parents, we have frequent contact in which we're working to support them in putting their learning into practice in their contact with the child, and we will tell you in a few months how that is going. We will come back to you early and tell you how it's going. I said earlier, it's great when it works. Now, when it doesn't work is the crunch issue. Because one of the big difficulties then can be coming back and talking about contact having different purposes, and actually being able to adjust the frequency and the nature of the contact to reflect the different purposes. Now, why is that important? I would say to you, there is a message to the child in frequency. So we might have decided as adults we're on a different track. But if the child, especially the very vulnerable child, is having very frequent contact in which they are perhaps getting the same message about the possibility of going home, that's going to undermine the possibility of working with them in the interim towards a different alternative. So it's important to think about the message and frequency. And purposes, so it helps to be clear about the way in which contact will meet purposes that are in the child's best interests at the stage that you're looking at it. So you may be, as in one of your case studies, asked to think about advice to the sheriff, and alongside that asked to think about changes to parental contact. So just to think about some of these purposes a wee bit and just reflect on them. Interest, affection, concern for the child. Because I'm in this permanency game, sadly, I meet parents who clearly love their children, but who find it too difficult to demonstrate that love and care in the caregiving that they offer to the child. So that can be really compromising for the child. No one doubts their love for their children, but how is that demonstrated in the quality of the contact? So think about the quality of the interaction, because contact that's going to be positive should build the child's self-esteem. But if the quality is poor, it can actually, sadly, albeit unintentionally, do the opposite. It can actually interrupt the child's progress in developing confidence and self-esteem. Maintaining positive attachments, so that's one beneficial purpose. The child may be attached. Yes, they may be attached, but when we're talking about the few cases that come toward permanence, commonly the children aren't securely attached, and there may be very significant consequences to that. So particularly where in a positive attachment relationship, we hope that the contact does two things. it soothes the child's anxiety, and it supports their development, their exploration, their play, their learning. Sadly, in some situations that we come to you about as panel members, the child may have an attachment, but actually the memories of that attachment are complex and difficult, and the effect of it may be to raise the child's anxiety rather than to soothe it. Now, what are the consequences of that in ongoing longer-term contact when we're trying to offer healing experiences to the child? So it's an important purpose, but as we've said before, being careful about not making assessments based on what we actually see in front of us as panels, it can be misleading. And I know fearful, hypervigilant children who actually look okay in the contact, it looks all right, but actually we need to look at the impact of the contact more clearly in an analytical way to see whether it actually is in the child's best interests and is helpful to them in repairing past hurts. Now, this is a crucial purpose when we're thinking about moving towards permanence. Making sense of the past, especially the separation from home. So where parents deny concerns about care at home and give the child unhelpful messages which conflict with their memories of the reality of life at home, this can be profoundly unhelpful in a permanent placement away from home. It can be really difficult. I'm working with a little girl at the moment who's been injured. She's had fractures at her mother's hands and other forms of maltreatment, and the mother completely denies it. And in contact, the child is asking questions about this, and mother is, she's been convicted, but she won't accept the truth of it. Now, that is so undermining to the benefits of contact, because mum is saying, it's not the truth what you believe. Actually, I didn't hurt you, you were hurt at nursery. So that really does undermine very profoundly the potential benefits of contact, because how is that child going to make sense of the reason why she was removed from home and not returned? So that is a complex issue, because where we're working with parents who can't engage in the intensive work, we might be coming back to you to say, please reduce or even terminate the contact, because what's communicated in the contact or the way it's being conducted is not having a helpful effect on the child. And that experience of the child may be very different from, hopefully very different from our own experiences of attachment when we were growing up. So, and the second one is, that the next one is permission to be settled away from home. This is absolutely crucial consideration if children are going to benefit from face-to-face contact in a placement away from home. This little girl that I was telling you about with the fractures, she's living with her paternal granddad, and the mum in contact will never ever refer to life with granddad, won't refer to the children's daily lives. We'll talk about progress at school, but never their experiences of care in the granddad's home. What on earth is the message in that? That's so difficult for the children. So what do? They don't talk about it. They know they've accommodated it. They've kind of dealt with it by learning not to say anything. Now, how is that in their best interests? If actually many of their achievements occur in the placement with Grandad, in their life with Grandad, not just at school. And he's doing as best he can to help the children and heal the children from lots of different past hurts, but he's undermined at every turn. Now, what on earth is the effect of that on the child feeling permission to be settled, secure, and to deepen their attachments with Grandad away from home? So some parents then place the child in a conflict of loyalty, and I think that is a conflict of loyalty. So the message to the child is, if you're going to keep that attachment to me, you have to deny your real memories of what happened at home. So if you like, contact is not representing the truth. So there's another situation that I was involved in recently, a wee girl who was placed from the central belt up north, and she had very profound experiences of neglect at home. And then her parents maintained contact, but they weren't going to give her permission to be away from home. And there was a very nice picture of everybody at contact looking okay, smiling and looking pretty happy. So I see this child in a pre-adoptive placement, we're going to court, etc., about the contact. And the little girl the adopters are offering her photographs of this contact. They're trying to be positive about the birth parents. They're trying to be really supportive. And this lassie keeps hiding these pictures. They get lost somehow. Anyway, I saw her in the place and I said, don't you like having those photos? If you tell me, Mum, she said, I don't like them. They're not the truth. She said, I remember what it was like. So she talked about the experiences of neglect at home. And the experience of that indirect contact really didn't fit with what the child's experience. So really important that we think about what work is being done with the child to make sense of their experiences, to help them to think about what happened and to put that together with their sensory memories or their other memories of what life was like at home. We're not talking about blaming parents. We can acknowledge the parents' love for the child, but we also need to acknowledge the quality of caregiving. And one of the alternatives, if we don't do that, is the child blames themselves. And that is a major kind of challenge and problem for us, because many, many children who are separated from home blame themselves. It's so often the case in my individual work with children that I kind of anticipate it much of the time now, that it may not look like that, but underneath distress, anger, other expressions of feeling, you'll quite often find guilt, the child saying, if only I had behaved well, I would be okay. So many of those children say, I want to see more of my mum and dad. What we need to think about is seeing more of mum and dad actually going to benefit the child in the long term? Is there going to be a safe, secure return home? Or is the child actually taking responsibility for actions which the parent should be taking on board? False promises about the future might be a feature of some contacts, especially with our children who are beyond the age of about 3 and 4. And some parents burden children with their own distress. Very difficult when we think, I've worked with lots of children who've had a very difficult parting message from their parents. So we're going to think about the kinds of messages that children might be given in contact. These can be powerful. They may be verbal, but they may be non-verbal. So the assessments and the analyses of contact that are put before you are really important, and asking questions about these are vital too. So some of the kinds of messages: well, it's your fault you're not at home. Thinking about, there's somebody here from one of the residential units, that's so common. The message being, well, go and get yourself fixed and then you can come home because you're just so difficult, too difficult for us to manage. We may see in contact, as I did very recently, a little boy who had contact with his mum, dad and his brother and sister. The worry was scapegoating, that this little boy was blamed for everything that went wrong in the family, including conflict with his siblings. And what happened in contact was a reenactment of the concerns that led to the removal from home. He got marginalised, ignored. His brother and sister's drawings were praised and supported. He didn't get the attention. So there is no way that that contact was in his best interest, because it's confirming and affirming all the harm that he suffered when he was at home. So very worrying that he's in a healing placement, but then the contact brought him back, triggered difficult memories. So there are other messages which can be difficult. Well, you were fine at home and you've been stolen. Now, I think this little girl with the fractures believes she was stolen. If her mum's story is right and all this happened at nursery, well, why is she not at home? Maybe she's been stolen. Maybe she should try and be back home, or maybe she shouldn't be where she is. Very, very confusing. Really doesn't help children to settle in the long term. And there are other messages communicated For example, that your carers can't be trusted to look after you, your social worker can't be trusted to look after you. So the conflict between the adults is not just difficult business for the hearing, it can be very difficult business for the children if parents can't refrain from hostility and challenge, because the child is in a real conflict. They are in a position where they have to trust the workers and the carers, and yet they may be getting a message, it's not safe to do that. That is so difficult, and it can really preoccupy and interrupt children. And some parents communicate they're not really interested. I'm so distressed or angry, I'm just going to fight for you to come home, I'm going to take every chance to communicate that to you, and actually that's what might be acted out at the hearing. So that's why some children are not at the hearing, because of course that kind of message can be given, and some parents can't contain themselves, sadly. And there may be a message, I'm fighting to get you back. You know, I was thinking about a contact yesterday which we thought was pretty closely supervised, but actually there have been opportunities. Oh, watch out for the glorious soft play. Soft play is a venue, it's very difficult to supervise that and support the child in it, because there are opportunities for private talking, which, if that is a concern, of course it's not always a concern, but if that's a concern, it can be very worrying. I mean, these children picked up the message that Mum was fighting to get them back, and this was going to be effective. Now then, one thing that we can direct our attention to very usefully, rather than just thinking about the content of the contact, so it is important to think about the quality of the content of the contact, but also the impact. The impact is crucial. I can remember having a big battle with a colleague expert, somebody I was very fond of and had a lot of respect for, but we used to have big battles, because he would say, the crucial question is whether the child enjoys the contact. And I would say that is important, but I'm also interested in the impact of the contact, because sometimes they don't fit together, because the child may look all right in the contact for various different reasons, as we've thought. So the impact of the contact is really important to think about. That's why we gave you a sort of single sheet in case it's useful later. So keeping an eye on the child's development. Does the child go backwards in their development, in any aspect of their development around contact? Does it happen at other times, or is it confined to contact? If contact's reduced, how does that affect the child? Is the child more distressed, which would suggest it's something to do with separation, or is the child less distressed and more easily soothed? That can tell us a great deal. Self-esteem, is the child supported by contact to feel good about themselves, or, I'm saying again, about issues to do with self-blame? And security and attachment, does the child avoid their carers before or after contact, or do they cling anxiously or appear insecure? I was hearing about a little boy yesterday who is doing really well in his placement, but after contact he comes back and he rejects his carers for several days after the contact. Now that is really interrupting his capacity to make progress when the plan is not a return home. What's the quality of interaction? Is the parent tuned into the child's needs? Is there interest in the child, putting the child's needs first? Does the contact vary depending on the parent's mood? So if that's happened at home, the interaction varies depending on the parent's lifestyle and moods and behaviours, then how unhelpful to have that repeated in the contact. How is that going to safeguard and promote the child's interests if it continues into a permanent placement? Just asking that question. Are the adult's lifestyle issues impacting on the sessions? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. In fact, I was in a long contact with a mum, oh dear, the other day, who was having 3 hours contact with her little tiny one. And at the beginning of the contact, she seemed okay. Then she went to the loo and she came back lit up like a Christmas tree. All bells and whistles. But by the end of the contact, she was very drowsy. So what on earth was going on? Now, my point is, Not so much what's driving that and whether we can decide whether she's drug using or whatever, but what's the child's experience in that? That was completely unpredictable. You know, for the first hour, there's lots of jiggling, and the child's doing this because it's too overwhelming. So parents' lifestyle issues are absolutely crucial in the way that they can impact on their presentation in contact. So, for example, the other example the other day was a child who reacted really badly when his mum came into the room, and I thought, what's going on here? He was, you know, pulling away from her, etc., and he looked very anxious, and then he started to look after her. I thought, what on earth's going on here? Until I realised that she wasn't drunk, but she was smelling very strongly of alcohol, and that was enough to trigger this little chap, and he talked about it afterwards, because he has such acute memories of that. Okay, so even if the child appears to enjoy the sessions, does the impact of contact before or after meetings tell a different story? Is there empathy for the child's circumstances? Comfort for the child, regardless of the parent's own feelings? Can they really keep their own anger and distress away from the child so that they can talk about it with workers at other times? So we will be thinking about all the difficult decisions, about requests for termination of contact, because that can feel like a really cruel decision to be making. Not just cruel for the parents, but cruel for the child. So we must be thinking about the quality of the contact, what's the purpose, what's the impact, what's the effect of it, and how is the child going to benefit. So again, that duty we have to make decisions in the child's best interests, absolutely crucial. So thinking about those kinds of questions, those kinds of concerns we might have about the contact, how they appear in the analysis of contact that you get before you at a hearing, you know, will be really helpful, particularly when we're moving not perhaps to termination, but to a request for reduction of contact in cases when we have been having intensive, high-frequency contact to promote the possibility of return home. So remember, there's a message in frequency, what's been the effect of any reduction in frequency, and remember that these children are still in limbo, the point we made at the beginning of the afternoon, that the separated child's either suffering a conflict of separation or a conflict of attachment. Either they're separated from someone to whom they were attached, or they've actually had very impoverished attachment experiences and haven't had the possibility of making attachments. So either way, this child is in, albeit temporary protective placement, they're in a crisis. It needs to be decided. And your contact decisions are integral to the planning. They're not just a separate issue. And in one of the case studies, you have them joined as an issue in what you're asked to consider. But what I would say to you is delay has very profound implications on children. And often what we're faced with, commonly, I was hearing about a little boy in another area recently. He was removed shortly after birth, because of his parents' lifestyle, drug misuse. The drug misuse has not changed. The parents' contact is fine. They're very interactive with the child in the contact. They don't agree with the plan. They would not be able to support the child in moving to a permanent placement. They deny the concerns about the child's well-being, and yet contact has been retained twice a week, and he's now 3. Because contact has been retained at that level, we cannot find a family for him. So we have no predictability of care, and yet we have known for a long time that this child could not go home. If the permanence application in court fails, he will not go home. So how on earth are we going to provide predictability of care? And in this instance, it's actually merely the chance frequency of contact, continuing contact, which is actually interfering with the possibility of providing the secure base, and the predictability of care that we were saying was so important at the beginning. There are worries about some children in permanent foster care, I just want to say, who actually have some very difficult experiences in contact which is unsupported. So contact which happens unsupervised in their permanent foster placements. And this is a research of Julie Selwyn from York University. I could give you the reference to it. Really worrying. So how does that happen? We tend to be very protective about our arrangements for contact post-adoption, if it's going to be in the child's best interest. And the markers for me in that are, is there good quality contact? Does it support the child's self-esteem? And is there an acknowledgement of the past? So I'll give you 3 questions about that just at the end. So some of the contact that Julie Selwyn's talking about is for those children who are permanently fostered. Some of the children were experiencing a neglect of their emotional needs, repeated scapegoating in contact, put into loyalty conflicts about being settled with their permanent foster carers, or even re-traumatised by contact triggering painful memories and presenting the person who was abusive as a safe adult. So thinking about a boy who has unsupervised contact with his mum, but his brother is there, and his brother abused him. And there hasn't been acknowledgement of that abuse, and he's not being emotionally protected in that contact. Nobody's just saying there shouldn't be any contact, but the contact needs to meet his best interests and help him primarily to make those reparative healing attachments where he's going to be living in the long term. And sometimes, for example, that child who was scapegoated, what he experiences in the contact is a repetition of what he experienced at home. So the contact is not meeting his best interests. It's triggering very painful memories. Okay, so case law, what helps us? You have a sheet in your pack which reminds you of this lovely decision from Lady Smith in a contact case in permanence. It's a contact considerations in a permanence application. So this is court of session, so it's a senior court, so it's binding on us all. And the legal test for continued contact, so it's Lady Smith's judgment, it says on the single page. The legal test for continued contact in permanence is not whether contact causes harm. Sometimes there is an implication or an expectation that it has to cause harm for it to be legitimate to reduce it or terminate it. That's actually not the test. The test is whether or not it would safeguard and promote the child's welfare. So here's the actual quotation from the judgment, which I thought you might like to have with you in case you ever need it. The submission for the appellants, that was the parents, was that there was no evidence of LSK, that's the child, having come to harm from there being ongoing contact. That, however, says Lady Smith, is not the test. The issue was whether or not ongoing contact would safeguard and promote the child's welfare. So that judgment is binding on us all. So it helps us, it supports us in keeping our eye on the child. So when I'm thinking about contact in permanence, those last 3 questions, does or can contact heal past hurts? Like, is there an acknowledgement of the pain and hurt and the concerns that there were about care at home? Does it or does it not heal past hurts? I know parents who can acknowledge their failures. They're able to have continuing contact in which they acknowledge the mistakes they make. Does it or can it support developmental progress and healing? And the third question is, does it build or undermine self-esteem? So I find those questions helpful when I'm thinking about permanence, contact in permanence being in the child's best interest. I hope we've set a little basis for your discussion about cases in your small group. We're going to invite you to think about, there are a couple of cases there, just to set the discussion going and get you thinking about these really difficult dilemmas about continuing contact being in the child's best interests in permanent placement. So thanks.